Welcome to Killer Confessions, the channel that uncovers the darkest truths hidden behind seemingly ordinary lives, and sometimes in the most unexpected of places. I'm your host, Johnny Stephen. Tonight, we journey to Green Bay, Wisconsin, a city famously, almost singularly, known on the national stage as Titletown, USA, for its legendary Green Bay Packers NFL team. But beyond the roar of the stadium and the bright lights of Lambeau Field, this city, like any other, harbors its own shadows, its own untold stories of tragedy. Green Bay is a historic community, one of the oldest European settlements in Wisconsin, with a strong industrial base and a deeply ingrained reputation for being a relatively safe, family-friendly place to live. However, sobering statistics reveal that its violent crime rate is actually higher than the Wisconsin average, a stark reminder that darkness can lurk beneath even the most wholesome and welcoming exteriors. Our story begins on a spring night in May 2016, a night that was meant for music, laughter, and a brief escape from the routines of new parenthood, but instead tragically ended in a brutal, baffling murder. We're examining the tragic case of Nicole Vanderheiden, a young mother whose vibrant life was cut short, and whose disappearance after a night out with her boyfriend and friends would unravel a complex, twisted web of initial suspicion, misleading circumstantial evidence, and ultimately, a crucial technological clue from a most unexpected source, a simple Fitbit worn on a wrist. It was the morning of May 21st, 2016, when the Brown County Police Department in Green Bay received an alarming phone call. The voice on the line was that of Doug Dietry, his tone laced with concern as he reported his girlfriend, 31-year-old Nicole Vanderheiden, missing. Nicole was a devoted mother of three, their shared infant son, 6-month-old Dylan, and her 2 older children from a previous marriage, Michaela, then 10, and Tyler, 9, who lived with the couple in their Green Bay home during the week. A lifelong resident of Brown County, Nicole had deep roots and strong family ties in the area, making an unexplained departure highly uncharacteristic and immediately concerning. Police rightly treated her disappearance as suspicious from the outset. The previous evening, Friday, May 20th, Doug and Nicole had managed a last-minute night out, a rare occasion for them since the birth of their son Dylan 6 months earlier. They joined a group of friends, including Doug's old high school buddy Aaron Kalinsky, for a Steel Panther concert, a band known for its comedic glam metal stylings, at a local bar called The Watering Hole. Aaron Kalinsky later recalled the evening starting on a decidedly high note, everyone in the group excited and upbeat. He specifically observed Doug and Nicole appearing happy, smiling, and getting along well as the concert began, anticipating a fun night. After the concert finished, the group, still eager to continue their night out, decided to move on to another bar. It was Nicole who suggested extending the party. A friend with a family van offered to drive them all. However, Doug was nowhere to be found at that moment. He had last been seen talking with their mutual friend Greg Mathis and another woman in the designated smoking section of the watering hole, sometime around 10 p.m. Unable to locate Doug or Greg, and not wanting to leave Nicole on her own, the friends, including Nicole, decided to head to the next venue, a bar called the Sardine Can, arriving there around 11:30 p.m. At the Sardine Can, Nicole was seen drinking and interacting with other patrons and the bartender, still not appearing outwardly upset according to her friends. But an hour later, as the clock neared 12:30 a.m., and with Doug still conspicuously a no-show, the mood palpably shifted. Nicole tried calling Doug multiple times, but her calls went unanswered. When another friend in their group, Angela, then tried calling Doug's phone, he picked up. This perceived slight, him answering Angela's call but not hers, deeply upset Nicole, as it would most people in her situation. Aaron Kalinsky described how, as soon as Angela hung up, Nicole, in a seemingly rash decision fueled by alcohol and frustration, declared she didn't want to have any of it. and abruptly stormed out of the bar, apparently wanting to disconnect and take control of her own night, perhaps to walk home or call a cab. Aaron, concerned for his friend, followed her out to the street and tried to reason with her, compassionately suggesting he take her home to her young children. But Nicole, who had clearly been drinking and was now deeply agitated by whatever was transpiring between her and Doug, became combative. She pushed Aaron away and then, in a display of her distress, did what he described as a dead-weight thing, collapsing to the ground, crying, hitting his legs, and screaming at the top of her lungs. Her outburst on the street began attracting attention from passers-by, and Aaron, perhaps feeling helpless or embarrassed, backed off. He last saw her walking away from the bar alone, visibly upset, still using her phone. He yelled after her, "We could get you home faster to your child than what you're doing." And then, more pointedly, "You're a babe in the woods." A poignant, almost prophetic warning that she didn't acknowledge as she disappeared into the night. Doug Dietry and Greg Mathis finally arrived at the sardine can around 1 a.m., well after Nicole and the rest of their group had departed. According to Greg Mathis, who had known Doug since before their freshman year of high school and had been the one to convince the couple to come out for the concert that night, they had simply lost track of time at the watering hole. Engrossed in conversation with an old high school friend they hadn't seen in a while, Greg maintained that, at least early on, there was no outward sign of the conflict that was clearly brewing between Doug and Nicole. Around 12:20 a.m., Greg drove them from the watering hole over to the sardine can, with Doug leaving his own car behind at the first venue. Greg later admitted to police that they'd both had a few drinks each and had also snorted some Adderall, a prescription stimulant often misused for its euphoric and energizing effects, which Doug had apparently provided. While en route to the sardine can at 12:36 a.m., Doug finally called Nicole. By this time, however, she had already stormed out of the bar in anger. He told her they were on their way, but she was audibly upset, her words slurred and difficult for him to understand. He handed the phone to Greg, who also tried to speak with her. Nicole, suspicious, accused Doug of playing a trick on her. Greg tried to reassure her he would pick her up wherever she was, but at that point, her phone abruptly shut off. Greg believed her battery had died, rather than her hanging up on him. Unable to find Nicole after driving up and down the streets around the sardine can, Doug and Greg went into the bar anyway, perhaps hoping she might have returned or that their friends would still be there. She hadn't, and they weren't. Nevertheless, they stayed to have a few more shots, finally leaving around 2:15 a.m. They arrived back at Doug and Nicole's shared house approximately half an hour later, around 2:45 a.m. Nicole was not there. At this point, the possibility that Nicole was in some kind of trouble was becoming increasingly distinct. Yet, they reasoned, she was an adult. It was very late, and perhaps she was simply too drunk and upset and would eventually find her way back home by morning. After trying her phone a few more times without success, both Greg and the babysitter left Doug's house. Nicole never came home. In court testimony, Greg Mathis consistently stated that Doug had remained calm throughout that night and hadn't even seemed particularly angered by any of Nicole's behavior. Not even the barrage of accusatory text messages she had sent him between 11 p.m. and midnight, which included phrases like, "What bog, you with you abusive auntie." Doug himself also claimed he hadn't been overly fazed by this treatment, testifying that he'd responded back something kind of nicely, just trying to diffuse and maybe calm her down. Because she seemed upset, his text responses seemed to support this, including one that read, "LOL, stop and be good. I'll see you at the sardine can." However, in an earlier, non-testimonial police interview, Greg Mathis had painted a somewhat different picture of Doug's response during that phone call with Nicole, stating that Doug had been yelling at her, "Man, like, don't be stupid. Go back to the sardine can. What the hell are you doing?" Regardless of the precise tone of Doug's responses, he did not contact the authorities to report Nicole's disappearance until 4:30 p.m. the following afternoon, Saturday, May 21st. But a horrifying discovery had already been made hours before Doug's call. Earlier that Saturday afternoon, around 1:54 p.m., two teenage boys who were working to clear rocks from a farm field on Hoffman Road in Bellevue, a community neighboring Green Bay, had stumbled upon what they initially thought was a dead deer. Tragically, it was not an animal. It was the naked body of a woman, identifiable only by a single sock still on one foot and a concert bracelet on her wrist. A pink bracelet from the Steel Panther concert at the watering hole the night before. There was a distinct footprint on the victim's naked back. It was Nicole Vanderheiden. She had been brutally murdered. Shortly after 5:00 p.m. that evening, following Doug Dietry's missing person report, police officers arrived at his house. The first responding officer described Doug as looking pale and distinctly hungover when he answered the door. She noted no visible scratches or marks on his hands or arms that might indicate defensive wounds from a struggle. She did not, at that point, inform him that a body matching Nicole's description had already been found. Instead, she asked him for identifying features. He described what Nicole had been wearing when he last saw her at the watering hole: a black and gray striped shirt, black capri pants, and high heels. He also mentioned she would have a bracelet on. It was a pink bracelet for 21 verification. He was cooperative with the officer's questions and voluntarily gave them his phone for analysis. When the officer questioned him about Nicole's texts calling him abusive, Doug dismissed it as something she sometimes said when she'd been drinking or was simply upset, though he vehemently denied ever having been physically abusive towards her. He also mentioned that Nicole had a history of depression and had occasionally talked about suicide in the past, although she wasn't currently on any medication for it. He steadfastly maintained that the last time he had seen her was at the watering hole before she left with their friends to go to the sardine can. It was only after the officer left his house that Doug received a text message about the discovery of a body in a field over in Bellevue. The news was reported on the 10 p.m. broadcast, and Nicole's family had begun to panic. 2 hours later, at midnight, police officers reappeared at Doug's door. This time, they wanted him to come down to the station for a formal interview. He agreed. They asked him to go over the timeline for the previous evening yet again. During this interview, when left alone in the room, he was observed becoming increasingly agitated, at one point freaking out. Finally, after obtaining another detailed description of Nicole's identifying features, the police informed him that they believed they had found her. They also told him that they were in the process of executing a search warrant on his property, and that they needed to take the clothes he was wearing for forensic analysis. Doug appeared, by all accounts, devastated by the news of Nicole's death. He was released from the station at about 3 p.m. after this extensive interview, and his parents picked him up. Later that day, May 22nd, the police called and requested a DNA sample from him. On his lawyer's advice, he declined this request, preferring to wait until they had a warrant. But warrant or not, one thing had become abundantly clear to both law enforcement and the public: Doug Dietry was, at that moment, the prime suspect in his girlfriend's brutal killing. Nicole Vanderheiden, born Nicole Meyer on March 29th, 1985 in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, another city on the shores of Lake Michigan, was described as loving outdoor pursuits like nature walks and hiking. She graduated in 2003 from Denmark High School and then went on to college at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, graduating with a commendable double major in science and education in 2010. She took what she'd learned into her career, becoming a substitute teacher for the Green Bay area public school system, working primarily in elementary and middle schools, where her commitment to the children she taught and her friendliness as a colleague were widely noted. To supplement her income, she also worked occasional shifts at a nearby restaurant. Nicole had married a man named Brian Vanderheiden shortly after graduating high school, and together they had 2 children, Michaela and Tyler. The couple later divorced, reportedly because Nicole wasn't satisfied with her life at that time. Brian and Nicole, however, remained on good terms and shared custody of their children, with Nicole looking after the kids during the week and Brian seeing them on weekends. In the frigid January of 2015, a chance encounter changed the trajectory of Nicole's life again. When she met Doug Dietry in a bar called Jimmy C's, Doug was having drinks with some friends to celebrate an NFL football playoff weekend, and Nicole happened to be there too. They caught each other's eye across the room, wound up having a drink together, and, as the saying goes, the rest was history, until that fateful night in May 2016. Doug Dietry was born in August 1981 in Green Bay in Wisconsin, where he had lived all his life. He graduated from a local high school in 2000 and attended technical school. As well as doing some online courses, his main focus, however, was the family business, a contracting firm which his grandfather had started back in 1955. He started working on construction sites with his family when he was still in high school and continued to work for them as a subcontractor, as well as managing apartment rentals and undertaking general self-employed contracting work. The home he and Nicole would eventually move into was a home he and his family firm had built. It was only a month after their first meeting that Nicole became pregnant with Doug's child. She and her 2 older children moved into Doug's house by the end of summer 2015, and they were reportedly thinking about getting married in the future. They even talked about their infant son Dylan, who was born in October of that year, walking them down the aisle. But there was undeniable trouble in paradise. Texts from Doug to his mother, sent only a few weeks before Nicole's death, revealed deep dissatisfaction. "When the house sells, we're going to go our separate ways. Don't worry about it. It is what it is." Doug later claimed he didn't remember the specific conversation that prompted this and stated there was no evidence of the house actually being put on the market. He also sent another text on May 10th, just 10 days before that final night out. "I'm very seriously thinking about telling Nikki and the kids they have to move. I'm not cut out for this life one bit." He later tried to explain these messages away, saying, "I was having a little downer day or whatever, and, I just said that to my mom with not truly meaning it, I guess." The period after Dylan's birth was undoubtedly financially stressful, as Nicole had stopped working to look after their newborn, and Doug had also taken some time off work. He had only just gone back to working, with uncertain hours and much less time with his family. In May, meanwhile, Nicole was in the challenging process of transitioning Dylan from breastfeeding. With a lot going on at home, tensions were clearly running high. This stress manifested in texts from Nicole to Doug as well, like one on May 8th that read, "Thanks for making me feel like a piece of steak every day." Nicole had apparently also been confiding in her mother, Victoria Meyer, about her ongoing issues with Doug. After her daughter's death, Victoria told the police about an occasion when Nicole had wanted to go out to a wine tasting with Doug and had asked her mom to babysit. She'd said she would drop the kids off at Victoria's at 8 p.m. By 10 p.m., she still hadn't arrived. When Victoria called, Nicole was audibly upset. Doug, she said, had gone out at 8 p.m. for a haircut, despite knowing they had plans. While this was hearsay, relayed through a grieving mother, police found it indicative of a troubled relationship. Allegations from one of Doug's ex-girlfriends, who dated him in 2012, also surfaced. She claimed he had put tracking software on her phone and would turn up outside her work unannounced. She also said he continued to contact her on Snapchat even after their relationship ended, including in the beginning of his relationship with Nicole in 2015. Doug's internet search history also allegedly displayed visits to local escort websites in the days leading up to Nicole's death, and he had apparently searched for how to tell if Backpage Escort is undercover. The case against Doug seemed to gain significant traction on May 23rd, with the revelation of more physical evidence. 2 days earlier, On the morning after Nicole had last been seen, a neighbor of Doug and Nicole's had been mowing his lawn when he'd spotted a pool of blood near the grass line of his property. Assuming it belonged to an animal, and when he came across a length of black electrical cord nearby, he had simply tossed it onto the sidewalk, forgetting to throw it in the trash. But when Nicole was identified in the news reports 2 days later as the victim found in the field, the neighbor immediately realized the potential significance of what he'd seen and called the police. Investigators arrived to secure the scene at about 5:45 p.m. They found dried blood spatters in the street with clumps of blonde hair stuck to them, and the charging cord. These items were sent off for urgent DNA analysis. Meanwhile, they thoroughly searched Doug and Nicole's house. Previously, they hadn't been sure where Nicole had died. But now the grim truth was becoming clear. She likely died in very close proximity to her own home. Inside that home, they found what they believed was enough evidence to arrest Doug for her murder. This included a pair of Air Jordan athletic shoes that had possible blood spots on them, and a distinctive herringbone tread pattern that seemed to match the shoe print found on Nicole's back. There was also what appeared to be blood on the floor of the garage near Nicole's car. Nicole's autopsy had revealed 2 distinct causes of death: strangulation and severe blunt force trauma. She had suffered a staggering 241 injuries across her body, and her face had been beaten to the extent that it was horrifically unrecognizable. The police now strongly believed that the black charging cord found in the neighbor's yard was the weapon that had been used to strangle her. Meanwhile, Nicole's bloodied clothes had been discovered discarded on a highway ramp on the way to the field where her body was ultimately discovered. At 7 p.m. on the evening of May 23rd, the police arrested Doug Dietry. They believed they had collected enough circumstantial evidence to hold him in custody, but they still needed the final, crucial piece of the puzzle: a positive DNA result linking both Nicole and Doug to the murder weapon. And on June 10th, those DNA results came back, but not in the way the police, or indeed Doug, were expecting. The blood on the garage floor was determined to likely belong to a turkey Doug had shot weeks before while hunting. The spots on his Air Jordan shoes weren't blood at all. The blood and hair found in his neighbor's yard were indeed confirmed to be Nicole's, but there was absolutely no sign of Doug's DNA anywhere on those samples or near them. The charging cable also tested positive for Nicole's DNA, but crucially, it also contained the DNA of an unknown male. This new physical evidence threw the investigators' case against Doug into complete disarray. What if it hadn't been Doug who'd killed Nicole at all? One further, and arguably more definitive, piece of evidence served to exonerate him: the data retrieved from his Fitbit, a fitness tracker that, ironically, Nicole herself had bought for him. Forensic analysis of the device, which Doug had been wearing, revealed that Nicole had most likely been murdered between 300 p.m. and 40 a.m. on that fateful morning. During that critical 1-hour window, Doug's Fitbit had registered only 12 steps, a period of almost complete inactivity, between 3:10 a.m. and 6:10 a.m. The horrific attack on Nicole had been incredibly active and violent, a fact starkly at odds with Doug's recorded profound lack of physical activity during that precise time frame. The use of Fitbit and other wearable technology data in criminal investigations, while still evolving, has gained increasing acceptance in legal contexts, often providing crucial, objective timelines or alibis where previously none might have existed. The data was clear Doug Dietry didn't do it. So, the terrifying question remained: who did? The investigation lingered for months, threatening to turn into a frustrating cold case. But in August 2016, the police got their big break. Thanks to continued meticulous DNA testing, that unknown male DNA found on Nicole's sock had finally found a match in CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a national database containing DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic samples. The match was a man from Virginia named George Stephen Birch. Birch, it turned out, had recently moved to the Green Bay area and had been staying with a friend, Edward Jackson. In a seemingly unrelated incident, Jackson's wife's SUV, a red Chevy Blazer, had been reported stolen and was later found burned out on June 8, 2016. Birch was suspected of this crime, though he was never formally charged. Crucially, to avert suspicion in that SUV incident, Birch had claimed he'd been texting a woman he met in a bar that night and had voluntarily given the police his phone to prove his alibi. They had wisely cloned his phone's data and returned the device to him, allowing them to later examine its contents without his immediate knowledge. Within mere months of arriving in Wisconsin, George Birch had entangled himself in serious trouble with the law, first with the stolen and burned SUV, and now, far more gravely, with Nicole Vanderheiden's murder. So, who was George Stephen Birch, born in Hampton, Virginia, to parents he'd never known? He was adopted within a week of his birth. A physically imposing figure, he was a linebacker in his youth and earned the nickname Big Country as young as the age of 6 due to his considerable size. As an adult, he stood at an intimidating 6 feet 7 inches. His criminal history was as long as he was tall. In 1997, at the age of 19, he was accused of shooting a gang leader and neighborhood rival in the head while he was already out on bond for another offense. He was acquitted in that trial because the evidence wasn't deemed strong enough. 5 shots had been fired from at least 2 guns, and the fatal bullet was never recovered. Still, his criminal activities didn't end there. He received a suspended sentence for grand larceny in January 2016, and in March of that year, he had a trial scheduled on charges of heroin possession. But by May 24th, 2016, just days after Nicole's murder, he had been listed as a fugitive, having violated the conditions of his release by absconding to Wisconsin to stay with his old friend, Edward Jackson. Earlier, in February, he'd called Jackson to say that he and his wife, Beth, were on the outs and he had nowhere else to go. Birch had met Beth through his cousin in April 2000, and they married shortly after. They had 2 children together. But by 2014, their marriage had deteriorated, likely exacerbated by Birch's ongoing criminal activities. When he was released from jail to serve his suspended sentence, he told Jackson he was looking for a new start. And that's what Jackson tried to give him, picking Birch up from Chicago on February 29th. He was charging Birch $100 a week in rent, but Birch rapidly fell behind on his payments, even though he was working, first in a restaurant and then for a landscaping firm. Still, the relationship between the 2 old friends was reportedly going strong, and on May 21st, the very day after Nicole's murder, they went on a pre-planned fishing trip together. Jackson later reported that he didn't notice anything unusual about Birch's behavior that day, though he did note Birch spent most of the 2.5-hour drive, which began around 1:30 p.m., sleeping. After the SUV arson incident in June, the Jacksons asked Birch to move out and even bought him a bus ticket back to Virginia. He didn't go anywhere, however, and spent the next few months couch surfing in the Green Bay area. So, he was still in town when the police's attention, guided by the CODIS hit, turned squarely on him, and they realized they still had the crucial data downloaded from his phone from the investigation into the burned SUV crime on June 8th. Birch's internet search history on that cloned phone was damning. It showed that he had repeatedly, almost obsessively, viewed news stories about Nicole's death immediately after the discovery of her body on May 21st. This was his only internet search activity during that period, other than searches for pornography. He searched for news about Nicole on May 22nd, 24th, 25th, 26th, and again on June 5th and 6th. Even more incriminating was his phone's geolocation data. The use of such data, while sometimes challenged on privacy grounds, has become a powerful tool in criminal prosecutions. His phone's records showed that he had been at Richard Cremium's bar on the night of May 20th, a bar located only half a mile from the sardine can, where Nicole was last seen by her friends. He left that bar at 2:30 a.m. and, critically, went not back to the Jacksons' house where he was staying, but directly to Nicole's house. He stayed there, according to the data, from 3:01 a.m. to 3:52 a.m. Almost the entire window the medical examiner had established for her murder. Then, just after 4 a.m., his phone pinged near the highway ramp where Nicole's clothes were later found, and then at the farm field in Bellevue where her brutalized body had been discovered. He finally went back to the Jacksons' home at 4:22 a.m. This digital trail was enough. George Stephen Birch was arrested for the murder of Nicole Vanderheiden. Birch, as was his right, lawyered up. With his lawyer, he pleaded not guilty. And in his defense, he concocted a story that brazenly implicated Doug Dietry. He alleged that he had indeed met Nicole at Richard Cremium's bar on the night of May 20th, after she had stormed out of the sardine can. According to Birch, they were flirting with each other. He said that he drove her over to his temporary residence, Jackson's house, but claimed Jackson's father was there, and it killed the mood. So, he alleged, they got back in the car, and Nicole gave him directions to her own house, where they pulled up outside. They couldn't go inside. He claimed, because the babysitter was there, though he didn't explain why Nicole couldn't simply dismiss the babysitter if she wished. He then alleged that they had consensual sex in his car outside her home. The most audacious part of his story was his claim that Doug Dietry had then discovered them having sex in the car, that Doug had furiously knocked Birch unconscious, and that the next thing Birch knew, Doug was standing over him with a gun, and Nicole was already dead. Birch, in this self-serving narrative, claimed that Doug then forced him at gunpoint to help dispose of Nicole's body by putting it in the car and driving to dump it in a ditch. Birch said he obeyed out of fear. He claimed that when he took Nicole out of the car at the dump site, Doug was momentarily distracted, and he seized the opportunity, lunging at Doug, pushing him as hard as he possibly could, then running back to his truck and driving away. He further claimed that he later found Nicole's clothes were still in his vehicle, so he threw them out of the window on his way home. But the physical evidence, the DNA and the Fitbit data, remained irrefutable. It was not Doug's DNA on the cord used to strangle Nicole. It was unequivocally Birch's. And Doug Dietry had, according to his Fitbit, only taken 12 steps during those crucial early morning hours when Nicole was being murdered. There was also Birch's impressive, intimidating stature. At 6'7" and weighing in at 250 pounds, he was not a man who was likely to be easily physically overcome or forced to do something against his will, especially by someone of Doug's comparatively average build, and Birch's extensive criminal past, including his previous indictment for murder, strongly suggested that he'd likely been in dangerous, violent situations before and was capable of extreme violence himself. The prosecution, armed with this compelling evidence, presented a very different and far more plausible version of events to the jury. They made the case that George Birch did indeed pick Nicole up after she stormed away from the sardine can, but that she did not have consensual sex with him. Instead, they argued she likely refused his advances, and he, in a fit of rage fueled by rejection, had brutally raped her, beaten her savagely, and then murdered her. He then, the prosecution contended, drove her body to the remote farm field in order to escape detection. So the trial, which took place in March 2018, became a dramatic battle of two competing narratives, both centered around the same core set of facts, but with vastly different perpetrators. The jury was tasked with deciding whether Nicole Vanderheiden had been murdered out of jealousy by her boyfriend, Doug Dietry, or out of brutal rejection by a predatory stranger, George Birch. A significant moment came when Birch, during cross-examination, lost his temper when questioned about how he'd supposedly carried Nicole's body at gunpoint. The prosecutor referenced him dragging her, and he vehemently denied it, his outburst perhaps revealing a crack in his composed facade. During their deliberations, the jury, after about 45 minutes, asked to see the charging cord believed to be the murder weapon alongside other cords that had been found in Doug's garage for a direct comparison. This request suggested that Birch's story, however improbable, was indeed under serious consideration in the deliberation room. But after 3 intense hours, the verdict was returned. Guilty. George Stephen Birch had killed Nicole Vanderheiden. He was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide. In Wisconsin, this charge typically implies that the defendant had the mental purpose to take a human life or was aware that their conduct was practically certain to cause death, reflecting a deliberate and willful act. He was subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentencing judge described the crime as the most brutal murder that has ever been committed by one person in the history of Brown County. Birch appealed his conviction in 2021 on the basis that his Fourth Amendment rights to privacy had been violated by the use of his phone data at trial, arguing that the data had been initially downloaded to investigate a different, unrelated crime, the theft, hit and run, and burning of Jackson's wife's SUV. He also argued against the validity of the Fitbit evidence, contending that it had not been accompanied by an expert witness who could properly validate its accuracy, or else expose the potential flaws of such consumer-grade technology in a legal setting. The appeal was ultimately rejected, and his sentence was upheld. However, Doug Dietry's own legal troubles were not yet entirely over. In February 2017, nearly a year after Nicole's murder, Nicole's sister, who had been staying with Doug to help him look after young Dylan, who was by this time a toddler, alleged an incident of inappropriate touching and false imprisonment against Doug. He pleaded no contest to second-degree recklessly endangering safety and false imprisonment, both of which are domestic violence felonies, and also to a misdemeanor charge of negligent operation of a vehicle. He was ordered to pay a $1,000 fine and stay out of trouble until October 2019, in which case the felonies would be dismissed. In August 2018, Doug and Nicole's family sought and were granted $269,000 in restitution from George Birch. Part of Birch's sentence also stipulates that he cannot profit from any book or movie made about the murder. Any such profits must go to Doug and Nicole's family. Doug Dietry continues to raise his and Nicole's young son, Dylan, on his own, a child growing up without his mother due to a senseless act of violence. Johnny Stephen. A night that began with the simple intention of enjoying some music and a brief escape from daily life spiraled into an unimaginable nightmare, leaving a young mother brutally slain and a community in shock. Nicole Vanderheiden's life was violently extinguished, and her boyfriend, Doug Dietry, endured the horror of being the prime suspect in her murder for 16 agonizing days. Ultimately, a tiny piece of everyday technology, a Fitbit, combined with meticulous DNA work, finally pointed investigators to a predatory monster hiding in plain sight. George Birch's violent past had finally, definitively, caught up with him, but not before he inflicted irreversible pain and loss. This case serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the most crucial truth lies hidden in the most unexpected data, and that justice, though it may be delayed and take unforeseen turns, can indeed prevail. Thank you for joining us on Killer Confessions.